So Trevor and I don't share the total blame for this. This is Trevor and me, and we believe a panel should be for discussion, questions, pushing back and forth, not for canned speeches by panelists. So nobody has any opening remarks. I'm just making these announcements so you understand what the thing is. We call it open mic since what we will talk about is whatever anybody wants to talk about. So if you have some idea that something you want to talk about, fire it out in the way of a comment, not too long a comment or a question, and the panel will deal with it. Other people in the audience will raise their hands, deal with it, and we'll beat it until somebody decides that, hey, we've had enough and we should move on to some other topic. We're going to go to 1:45, which is about 40 minutes from now. Tomorrow, we're also scheduled to do this. I do know that there are a couple of people here that don't like the idea of such an open-ended panel. So if somebody doesn't like this and wants to organize their own panel on some specific topic, Trevor and I will be very happy to graciously give you the floor for tomorrow afternoon's panel. In the meantime, if not, we'll continue this open mic thing. I should also probably announce for next year, if somebody wants to do a targeted panel, which I personally hate, because it ends up being canned speeches, then let next year's chairman know that, and maybe we can work it into the program instead of our open mic panels. I think you know everybody on the panel. Luigi Carro, who's just eaten 3 of these sandwiches, so he's now a full professor at
My wife is dead, that's a lie.
Your wife is in the audience?
Yes.
Try not to embarrass her too badly.
That's too late for that.
Ed Lee, who is, I don't know, are you chairman of the department now, or?
Thankfully, not anymore.
Not anymore, yeah, but you were probably properly introduced this morning while I was asleep, so I don't need to do that. Trevor, you know, and the Bulgarian you also know, who's now at Chalmers University, having finally weaned himself from Delft. Okay, so, do you have anything you want to add? No? Anybody have anything they want to add before we get started?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would just like to comment that I like the idea of a PowerPointless panel.
And if you are clever enough, you can extend this, use the opportunity to ask 4 questions about the keynote this morning. Sorry for this.
Okay, so, who wants to get us started? Go ahead, John.
Maturity. You've seen it all go through. Technology, what's next? You know, there's not a lot of new happening at the moment because there's so many patents going on that have been disputed out with that in the 60s. What do you think is going to be the next big micro-architectural thing as opposed to just bolting smaller, simpler things together?
So I have a comment about that it's not maybe not a complete answer, but I think we can take a lesson from the world of patents, where it's really, you can patent anything, you know, even if there's plenty of prior art. And I think in the research community, we should also be a little less afraid to reintroduce old ideas. I think there's often a lot of value in going back and re-examining things. I personally think we put way too much emphasis on what is novel versus what is good. And I'd really rather have us focus on what is good rather than what is novel.
And the good things are going to be?
Well, that's, they're going to be, of course, the things I described in my keynote this morning.
But you unfortunately...
Which I sector,
No, so I understand this morning you talked about the HEP and correctly pointed out that if you do that style, you don't need branch prediction because you don't need the next instruction until long enough in the future that you've already got the condition that the branch was based on. So branch prediction goes out the window. I was told that that was one of the things you talked about.
Yeah, I didn't mention the HEP, but that was as far as
well,
I
the
know.
control data 6600, which is actually where they have, where Burton got the idea before that time.
Right, but I did mention that I first learned about this technique from you.
I
way
am
back
flattered.
in 1983.
That's correct. Fall semester 83, in fact. Yeah. You say that people, so I'm wondering if the reason why, how do I put this gently?
Do it bluntly, we all know it.
So the patent thing is, you certainly would agree, I think, that if you do use an old idea, you should give credit to the old idea, right? And say, I am building on that old idea, right?
Well, if you're an academic, certainly, but
Yeah.
if you're trying to patent something, that's usually not a good
That,
idea.
that's correct, and so you differentiate, that's right. But, so he said, what's the next great thing? And you said, there's no reason why you can't use what was done in the past, but you would say to use what was done in the past, but give credit to the people who came first, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm on the academic camp. We don't
Right.
attend to patent things, and so I try to bend over backwards to give credit.
Right.
If we're working in a company, I certainly would do that.
Absolutely.
I mean,
So I want to finish the point, and then, so the point being that how many of these students even know that it was invented before, since none of them ever read the history of the field?
Well, they don't read the current results either.
Yeah.
You know, we have a basically write-only literature.
I think the average paper is read by like 3 people outside of
The reviewers.
Yeah.
And the guy's mother-in-law or something.
So related to that, you know, there's perhaps some people here that were influential on this. I'm very hostile on the idea of double-blind reviews for exactly this reason. You can really only count on 3 people reading your paper, the reviewers, and if they're going to use your ideas, you'd really like them to give you credit for them, but they don't know who wrote it, they can't do that.
So I'd rather even go one step further than not have double-blind reviews. There are so many papers that get published that have never been reviewed because reviewers have, reviewing is a thankless job. And so a lot of people who will just say, yeah, I'll publish it without bothering to review it. So what I would have, if I was, you know, in charge, if a paper gets published, it carries the names of those reviewers
yeah.
who said this paper is worth publishing.
That's good. They do that in physics.
Do they? Well,
Yeah, that's right.
so we certainly don't do it in our field.
So just to sort of reinforce the point about reusing old ideas, I always thought of computer architecture actually is, there's only about 4 ideas anyway, so you're forced to reinvent them, but you do it in a context of a changing technology. You know, what made sense when, say, wires were instantaneous may not make you, some ideas then that look silly may in today's world not look silly. So the idea of sort of recycling these things, but you know, projecting them on a different technology is, I think, quite a bit of what one might want to do in computer architecture space.
I just want to come back to John's questions. There's one aspect which I find very interesting from a historical perspective, that computer architecture has always been driven by applications. And the first set of applications, designers were worried about area. Then they started being worried about performance. And then all of a sudden energy came into play. So maybe on the level of what you're talking about, we have this ever more complexity, complex problems to solve, and technology is changing. So the new thing is, what new applications are you talking about, I would say?
Or it could be how to approach these dimensions at the same time, because it has always been the case that if you start with performance, then at some point power hits you and say, oh, okay, what about power? Oh, we'll use some low power libraries and then this will solve our issues. But, you know, having, for instance, power, as you guys are doing pretty much very good, I think, as a primary citizen design during the whole process, is indeed a very good thing to do. But another we're trying, I was afraid that we're going a little bit away of the question, so I'm happy that Trevor and Luigi came back to the original question. But something very interesting was briefly touched, and I know that Yale has a very strong opinion on that one, is the issue on patents. So patents are meant to basically motivate innovation, right?
It's a theory.
That's the theory, but they kind of prevent innovation. And the question is, what is the role of the academia in that? Of course, industry, it's no question asked about. They have to do the secret of development and do not let anybody else know, or else the teacher will pick it up, and then of course the advantage is gone. But what is the responsibility of the academia in this innovative part? Because obviously, if there is something really great in new drone, and if it's going to be developed by the industry, you will hear about that only when the product or close to product is available. The question is, should academia do the same? Should go the same path? I think it should not, because it's public money. In most of the cases we use for paying our students, sometimes donated by the industry, but the results should go in the public domain.
I think Trevor, go ahead.
So, as you said, the computer architecture follows the application, or as architects would say, form follows function, right? In the past, we had, for mainframe processor architectures, there were the Lawrence Livermore experiments. These days, the keynote, the sessions, cyber-physical system, embedded systems means you have way more applications. Is this trend now reflected, so to say, in the current approach that we see also heterogeneous accelerator-rich architectures, where the accelerators are then, so to say, the application followers? And could you comment on kind of where this trend towards accelerator-rich in combination with multi-core, where you see that this will bring us in the future? There were also in the DAC keynotes, there were also, I think, IBM, Intel, ARM, they uniformly said essentially they don't do, I interpret it like this, that full custom design for digital is dead, because you use tools now for your back-end layout process, etc. This enables then Intel to crank out Ivy Bridge variants in a couple of months or a couple of weeks. So where will this bring us, also with respect to that Boeing, for example, needs then to pile up one particular processor for 50 years?
So let me say several things. First of all, I disagree with Luigi that it's the applications that drive things. Coming up with better usage of the microarchitecture to gain performance, and in the current world, that performance has to be sensitive to the energy requirements. But nobody's willing to give up on performance altogether, otherwise you would replace an ALU with a full adder.
Sorry, let me rephrase. When I meant applications, I meant market. So there's a demand for something, and people will deliver it.
Okay, so I'll even take exception to that. I strongly believe that coming up with a faster processor, and now it has to be energy-aware faster processor, because otherwise, as I started to say, we would replace the ALU with a full adder, and it might take us 32 cycles in order to do a integer 32-bit add. But if we come up with something that outperforms by a lot, that becomes an enabling condition, which then means people can now say, I can now look seriously at my problem because there's a machine that can actually do the problem. Right?
Yeah, but faster means faster for what? Faster for one particular application. A GPU is faster for streaming media, but not so good for control center.
Fine. Faster, period. Because there are a lot of applications that, so in fact, so what you do is you just prove my point when you say faster for what, because I'll answer, I don't know for what. But if you look at the computer today, you look at the computer 40 years ago, what was the computer being used for 40 years ago? And a lot of the things which is being used for today, nobody used it 40 years ago because nobody had any idea that the computer would be able to produce the performance that was required. So an enabling condition for its own sake, okay? That's point number one. Point number two is that I'm delighted to hear you and John also said it. It seems to be that everybody's now jumping on the bandwagon. I used to feel like the Lone Ranger, the only one who talked about heterogeneous. Everybody was saying, no, they have to be homogeneous because you'll never get a company to produce a multi-core where the cores are different. Now that was a long time ago, like 2 years ago. Now finally everybody has jumped on the heterogeneous. Accelerator rich, I agree with that. What will the accelerators do? In fact, the guys, I guess what's his name? Mark Horowitz, Cunley. The domain-specific applications on the accelerator. Fine. But how do these things tie together? And that's microarchitecture.
So can I make a comment?
Sure, absolutely.
So on this question that nobody's talked about heterogeneous multi-core, that's absolutely not true. In fact, the very first cell phones were heterogeneous multi-core processors. In the first ones, they weren't integrated onto a die, but they became integrated onto a die. And they were heterogeneous for a very interesting reason, I think. It's not that, you couldn't get enough cycles in the CPU that was handling the user interface to also do the speech coding and so on. You could get the cycles. The issue was that nobody knew, and to this day, nobody still knows, how to combine those hard real-time functions of the speech coding and the radio control with the general so-called, what people have been calling general purpose computing, which is fundamentally rooted in this model of computation that we think of as dating back to Turing and Church, where all we're interested in is transforming data, right? We start with a data set, we run an algorithm. What we mean by computation today is that, starting data set, finite sequence of operations, ending data set, that's a computation. So to me, I actually agree with you very strongly about markets. That in a sense, cyber-physical systems are a really, truly transformative market because it's not enough to do this transformation of data well. It's absolutely not enough. And I also, therefore, disagree on this focus on performance, that all you want is more performance. So this morning, I actually made a distinction between timing as a performance property versus timing as a correctness property. And I argued that timing needs to be part of the semantics of computation. This requires actually rethinking Turing and Church, because those models don't do this.
So timing equals synchronization, I guess, is what you're...
No, timing means timing. It's, we can get into a deep philosophical discussion about what time means, but let's just use the contemporary vernacular of what it means, when things happen.
So let me correct myself. When I said nobody was talking multi-core, I meant the general purpose multi-core chip that all these companies were talking about producing, and they were talking about these specific, let's say, historically analog functions.
TI has made more heterogeneous multi-cores than Intel has shipped x86s. So in volume, the heterogeneous multi-cores have outstripped the single homogeneous CPUs by a lot. Every cell phone has one. So in volume, these are not esoteric little corner market kind of things.
So embedded systems are certainly not esoteric minor markets. They outstrip tremendously. Your heterogeneous, I would argue, are heterogeneous in the sense that the cell phone is a perfect example. There are functions that are on the cell phone and you say, okay, I need something to handle this function.
And you can get, so I think maybe, I don't know if the words edge mouth, but it's easy to go out and on your SOC and drop in a codec, because some guys got the IP for that, and put it, rather than try and run it together with a bunch of other threads on the general purpose core and get it.
Codecs. These are DSPs. They're Turing complete microprocessors. They just happen to do certain things better than others. They've got a single cycle multiply and add. They have controllable timing so that you can get the hard real-time functions. But they are Turing complete general purpose CPUs.
I want to come back one step back to Andrea's question, because one important aspect that you raised, and I sort of understood this, is that we're not talking about computer microarchitecture anymore. We're talking about the integration of higher abstractions. That's what we need. That's what products need. And this morning you mentioned the cell phone, which is different from cyber-physical systems, not only at the hardware level, but fundamentally at the abstraction level we're talking, the kind of service we're going to provide. That opens up opportunities for other things. So I would say no, I don't think people just want performance. People are selling systems, and each system has different characteristics. Now, the big trick or the big question for me is how you deliver these specific characteristics on a timely manner, on a cost-effective manner. And that's good news. That means we can do research.
Deliver on in a time, so you sound like a businessman. As
I am.
opposed to
I just am an unsuccessful businessman. I'm a professor. But I love the idea of
Luigi,
making money.
listen, on that level, indeed you can consider this heterogeneous system on a chip, like a system that in some sense represents the accelerator model that we are talking about. And then of course the trick is what kind of microarchitectural improvements we will do for this specific function. And then of course you can do many interesting things that are not possible when you really want to go completely general purpose
But that's the
complete.
scenario, yeah.
And that's exactly
I mean, nowadays,
when you start reinventing or reintroducing old interesting ideas and really apply them for a specific function.
So it's not a microarchitecture problem.
no, I'm not
So
saying
we
it's
have
just
companies
a
here that are trying to put a GPU and a CPU on the same chip, and they're
Yes.
failing miserably. That's not a microarchitecture
It's
problem.
definitely a microarchitecture problem. I'm just saying that you need more than that. New problems arise because people are looking beyond that.
No, new problems arise because the computer has a chance of handling the new problems.
Absolutely true. But you
That's
still
where I'm
have,
coming from. Make a higher performance engine, and they will beat a path to your door.
so if I,
So I agree with the cell phone thing, but I guess, so maybe there's something philosophical here that I don't feel compelled to waste the next 50 years of my professional life. I'm actually at a mid-career crisis right now. I gotta decide what to do with the next 50 years. And I don't wanna waste it on cell phones. I'd rather waste it on curing cancer or something.
but for example,
And that-
perhaps you need some biological information from the DNA to cure cancer. And perhaps you need some high-performance stream-based things to do that at real time. So, but tuned to that specific problem. That's what we're claiming here. So that's a very good hot topic for the next 50 years. Go ahead, I think it's honest.
Go ahead.
Yeah, also maybe I will address a little the question that you asked about those, say, heterogeneous systems using hardware accelerators. Actually, if we look at many current applications, especially in telecom, multimedia, but also in another fields that were mentioned today already, like those cyber-physical systems, several of them, because they are very different, of course. Then what we can see that there are many complex applications. And actually in those applications that involve several different parts, many different algorithms, so processing patterns basically are present. And these are inherent internal features of those applications. Actually, if you know, that's one. So we have heterogeneous computation patterns in those applications. That's one. Another thing is that for many of them, extremely stringent requirements are imposed. For instance, for the US communication system standards, requirements are like, for instance, regarding the throughput mentioned here, or computation speed, but throughput in this case, from 1 to 6 gigabits per second throughput, like for LDPC decoding, for instance, and so on. Similar requirements are for decryption engines, for instance, and so on. And in all those applications, to satisfy this throughput, you must use massively parallel hardware accelerators. So it cannot be any, say, programmable processors. It must be hardware processors. And you have to use massive number of such hardware processors. Although the processors themselves are parallel, so vector processors, for instance, and you use like 300 of one kind of processor, another 150 or so, another kind of processors, only for one task, for instance, for the LDPC decoding, or for one decryption. Yeah? So then, if you think about the whole system, it must be a combination of various programmable processors with several such, sometimes, hardware, massively parallel hardware accelerators, and this is the realization. So, but I want to tell here one remark more before I finish. Actually, this is required for those most demanding applications. While in the same time, we have also to analyze, say, many less demanding applications that do not require so high throughput. Mainly this is regarding the throughput, and then the second is energy consumption, of course, those three main demands. But there are a lot of applications that you don't require this high throughput, you are happy with much lower throughput. Even the same LDPC codes are also used for lower end systems where you don't require for them such a throughput. So the same kind of function can have completely different parametric requirements, for instance. And in this case, you can use, for instance, a standard general purpose processor, or say signal processor or GPU, dependent of what a particular application part is. Yeah? So it depends very much not only what are the computation patterns, but also what are the actual parametric requirements, what you will use.
So can I react? To me, I see all of this as putting lipstick on the pig, right? That, yeah, we can tweak the microarchitecture, put in some custom function units that accelerate certain things, and we can argue forever about whether, the cost-benefit trade-off. I don't think this is the key problem. So I'd like to react to what Yale said about curing cancer as being the goal. I certainly, I think I first heard it from you that, a new computer is like a new telescope, right? You gain scientific knowledge by having capabilities. I think this is absolutely true, and I agree with it. But I think we're stuck in a mindset that has been defined by the scientific computing world about what that really means. Let me state a societal scale problem that I think is every bit as important as curing cancer, which is sustainable energy. And this problem to me is the crowning problem of cyber-physical systems. So envision, every watt that is used serving a genuine human purpose. Okay, what's it going to take to do that? It's going to take cars that orchestrate their actions with the infrastructure that orchestrate their actions with each other, so that you never stop at a red light. Okay, that cannot be done with performance alone.
You don't
it
think
cannot be done with performance.
So you don't think that performance is, so I agree with you, that is a critical problem.
And
in fact, I would say that that's on a par with curing cancer.
Yeah,
but you don't think that problem is that performance is a major contributor to being able to do that?
I think performance is secondary.
To what?
To achieving that. I think we really need to rethink computing and networking. So in order to get cars to never stop at red lights, right? Think of the level of safety that you require in order to actually deploy a system like that. Performance is a quality measure. More performance is better, it generally costs more, okay? And you want, it's a trade-off, right, about whether you're willing to pay it. In order to deploy systems like this, we need correctness properties, not performance properties, okay? So what I was arguing for this morning is rethinking the computer architecture problem so that your objective is not to, you know, on average run benchmarks a little bit faster, but rather your objective is to efficiently deliver exactly, precisely repeatable behavior in a temporal sense. Give the system a repeatable dynamics, okay? Much as today, we're extremely good in software systems at giving repeatable computation. We're extremely good at this, right? A computation that is specified as an algorithm will execute on any microprocessor today with 10 nines of reliability and do exactly what was specified in the code, okay? We don't do that with timing, and as a consequence, we can't control dynamics of systems with software at the level of reliability and precision that's required to solve this energy problem. And I think this is a huge opportunity for computer architects because they can use a lot of the same innovative techniques. We can resurrect old innovations, but rethink them in the context of a new objective criterion, right? This objective criterion isn't just running these benchmarks on average a little bit faster. It's about getting this temporal behavior into the semantics of the computation and delivering this 10-9 reliability.
So that's twice now that you said a little bit, to run benchmarks a little bit faster. That's twice you said that in the last 5 minutes. I would argue that that's pejorative. I'd also argue that to get the thing, by the way, this repeatability of software tends to work if you have one processor. When you try to run that software on 2 processors, it becomes a lot less repeatable.
That's because we're using really shitty concurrency models, like threads, for example. You don't think that, so performance, maybe there's a communication problem with the word performance. Performance means you can do things so much faster that it allows you to do more sophisticated algorithms in time in the sense of in real time, in time to be delivered when it needs to be delivered.
You're sort of saying that performance can be equated to other things. If you could do it really quickly,
That's right.
you
Then
can
it
throw
enables.
performance at a problem. So
Then it enables the kind of thing that it wants to do.
So let me put it this way. By leveraging improvements in performance, we can mask the bad engineering that's ultimately going on. And that's true, and in fact, I would argue that that is what embedded systems are today. It is performance masking bad engineering.
Okay, there definitely a class of problems, and actually I'm not advertising Oscar's talk tomorrow, but he will be showing some of these problems tomorrow, where when you have more performance, they can do more sophisticated computation, and by then this will decrease significantly the simulation time and will, of course, eventually have an impact on our life. And, you know, let, for instance, the gas and oil companies find oil much faster, not in terms of months, but in terms of weeks. But definitely there is the embedded system or cyber-physical system class of problems where you may need a different tool, right? You need a telescope to look at the stars, but you need a microscope to look at the cells. And this discussion before, and I'll ask Stamatis to ask his question because he's raising his hand already for 10 minutes, sorry Stamatis, was very nice. And now we're talking about accelerators, we're talking about application specifics, and all the electronic computers, they started with the ABC, which was the application-specific machine. It could do nothing else but solving differential equations, right? So the ENIAC came with the general purpose concept. And now, again, looking at the other side, looking at these huge challenges like cancer, killing, and probably the child got inspired by you, Yale maybe, and they're building the Anton basically application-specific supercomputer to try to solve a specific problem. But there is definitely a class of problems, but not performance-only models. I tend to agree with Luigi and Don. Yes. And that's Max.
Interrupt this.
Yes, please.
I kind of agree with you, kind of. I think
Kind of.
you're
Thank you.
focusing on two different application domains. And you're saying one thing matters with performance, that's one domain, applications, where performance matters. And you say that handling events, for example, is what matters, that's another domain, what matters. Or having this done with as little power as possible, or as little space as possible is another thing that matters in another domain. If you see more broadly what is that, what is happening, my understanding is, my view is that what is happening is that we should focus more generally on the usability of the platform. If the usability of what is produced by a technology generation is improved, if you improve this usability, then every domain can benefit. So in this case, what technology produces is multicore. So you need to improve the usability of multicore technology. Actually, we kind of had this similar conversation with Professor Patt in a summer school that was about 10 years ago, 9 years ago. It was the beginning of my PhD, and right then I was thinking that actually quantum computing might be very interesting, and that if quantum computing came to be an effective technology, usable technology, then computer architects would have to find a way to use their techniques to handle quantum computing.
Yes, but I'm confusing the means with the questions.
So the question was that, so what is the best thing to do? What is computer architecture all about? What should we focus on? I think we should focus on usability, and let me add the final point to this. If you look at the internet and what is happening in the applications in the internet, what is the best thing to spread the use of an application is the usability of this application. So if you look at Facebook, it's much more usable than Google Plus. So that's a central issue to this kind of technologies. Internet. So I'll leave it there.
So can I react to that, because I think you raise a very good point, and I'm a great fan. I do a lot of coding these days myself, even though that seems to be unfashionable among people my age. But I use Java and Eclipse, and I find Eclipse to be an absolute marvel of having improved the usability of the technology. It's phenomenal. I mean, it's really transformative. I can do a whole lot more than I ever was able to do through the tools that are provided in. Let me contrast that with what the guys at Boeing and Airbus use to write the control software for the fly-by-wire aircraft. Okay? By FAA regulation, they're not allowed to use any high-level languages. Okay? The code is written in C. It's written in a very stylized way. They're not allowed to use interrupts. In fact, they can't use any of the wonderful object-oriented techniques that we've developed. I mean, if they could use the techniques perhaps, but they can't use any of the supporting tools for them. Why? Is the FAA just being archaic and draconian on this? No. It's because these tools are actually completely mismatched to the problem. And in fact, most of the techniques that we've developed over the last 40 years interfere with the mission that those guys have to accomplish, rather than helping with the mission that those guys have to accomplish. Now, you can overcome this with performance. I mean, if you fly big enough iron and can provide enough power to it and fly enough of them to get redundancy, you can overcome this with a really shitty engineering design that weighs twice as much as it needs to, consumes vastly more fuel than it really should consume. Okay, and is it really safe? Well, it's going to be a much more complex design with many, many more parts than a highly tuned engineering design. So it's probably going to be fundamentally less reliable. It's going to be really hard to make it as reliable. It's bad engineering masked by performance.
Yeah, so I guess I figured out where our disconnect is. You really have a problem with stupidity. And what you're suffering from is performance correcting for stupidity, and what you'd like people to do is think. And I certainly can't quarrel with that. I mean, if people have developed bad tools, and the tools are completely mismatched, but they're allowed to use them anyway, and performance then allows them to hide behind this bad use of tools, I'm certainly not going to argue in favor of that.
Okay,
So,
but then I
so I agree with you that people ought to be encouraged to think.
So if I accept that, which I'm not going to for reasons that will become immediately obvious, I would have to conclude that branch prediction is stupid.
So in certain domains, branch prediction is stupid.
It's rampant out there.
I'm sorry?
It's rampant. It's hard for these guys at Boeing to avoid it. Right?
So I need to
They're
look.
working around it.
They're working around it. And they're masking its stupidity with performance. Because they don't have the luxury of, nor frankly the expertise to design their own microprocessors and tool chains. We're failing as a community to deliver to them the tools they need.
So Britton Smith, and in fact before that, in J.E. Thornton, in the mid-60s, found a way, you know, the CDC 6600, that made branch prediction. So this was long before branch prediction was even thought about. In the mid-60s, you didn't need branch prediction. You had the peripheral processors, and you there was no problem. And from what I'm sorry, I slept through your. You know, I didn't get up until late. It's my problem.
It's okay. Some of the people who were here slept
No,
too.
But the point is that you're absolutely right that if you design, if you design using what Thornton did and what Britton Smith did, then you don't need branch prediction. But
yeah, but it's in a sense the same what Yale was saying earlier. So if somebody tries to look at the moon using a microscope, you know, it's going to be problematic. You know? And of course, we have to help them with the right tools. So I agree with you completely. The programming models and maybe the domain-specific languages that they need to do the task, the engineering task that they are supposed to do. And indeed, the focus was too much on the general purpose processor. And that's why these tools went into that directions and all this.
by the way, your model with the HEP and the CDC 6600 works for a certain application domain. It doesn't work. You have to have enough threads, for example. So maybe you're saying,
So
let's rethink the whole problem of being able to run these threads concurrently.
Yeah. So that was.
So you want to kick it to the software, is what I guess you're asking.
That was certainly part of the case that I was making. But what the real case that I'd like to make is that I think that there's enormous opportunities for innovation here. That I think that as a community, in the community that I'm in, these opportunities have largely gone unnoticed. So some time ago, Dave Patterson, sort of scratched his head and looked at me and said, why are you so interested in embedded systems? That's just software on small computers. These are not small problems. These are, in fact, huge opportunities that could have a transformative effect on our society and our culture. I think they are worthy of our attention. And they're not only worthy of our attention, but they're more worthy than trying to eke out,
Here we go.
5%
That's the third reference to.
improvement on the benchmarks, which is not, to me, interesting.
That's not what I'm talking about. Even though you said it 3 times.
So it's great to see this because we recognise this in ARM. We have 2 ranges of processors.
Of course.
agreeably, we talk about a general purpose, high performance, irking out the last few percent, as best we can.
What are
Time
you,
frame.
brother?
That's what my talk focused on. These are A-class processors. The real-time ones, this is where the problem is, because they also need performance, but they need it down to a cycle accuracy. So
And
we're struggling.
that's yet another point in the design point, is to be able to, and I certainly don't quarrel with that.
But I think also for embedded systems, as you mentioned, you agreed it's a large market, and I think predictability issues will also become very dominant in the future if you look at the silicon that is not working correctly anymore, and timing being just one activity of timing is one aspect, and I think there will be even now with correctness of fault freeness, other problems coming in that might revolutionize also microarchitecture and the way you're implementing a system, and that speaks basically for co-design.
So
Okay, so we have run over by 5 minutes already, and that's taking time away from my time in the water. So, to be continued tomorrow. That's
On the beach, let's go do that.
to the beach.